Hello, BookTube. It is a Wednesday early evening. Pretty day here in Vermont. I thought after a day on the computer at work, I'd do a book tag. Haven't done one in a while. This one's particularly interesting to me. And it's the American Revolution book tag. It's an original tag by Bill Ruttenberg, a channel that's new to me. I've had a chance to look around a bit, and very interesting. And this tag reflects that, at least from my perspective. So I've got a lot of books here, and only one beer, so I have to do this in fairly decent order. I wish they'd rename that beer. But anyway, so the American Revolution book tag questions and prompts. Number one. What are some good books you've read covering the pre-Revolutionary War period? And I have lots of them. And I grabbed one that had a big impact on me when I started. I've been reading about the American Revolution since I was, in high school, like most people, but I've kept up at it. And so, 40 plus years I've been reading about the Revolution steadily. And this is one of the ones that really gave me background. It may be a bit dated, but that matters what you mean by that. It's a narrative history, I think, of the First Order, and that's Paul Revere and the World He Lived In by Esther Forbes. Wonderful, wonderful book. When did this... And here is the world he did live in the Boston area. The years that preceded the American Revolution were years of mounting hate and fury. Throughout these years, Paul Revere lived at the point of the flame, but unlike the salamander, he never changed his colors. Steady, dependable, indefatigable. I love saying that. His was the brain and hand that organized the mechanics of Boston for the patriot cause, and by so doing, ensured its triumph. So he was a craftsman. So that's what they're talking about with the mechanics. Paul was Revere was a typical ingenious man of his period. Now, Esther Forbes can write, and this is just a wonderful, wonderful volume. There's great illustrations. It's a good place, I think. It may be in print. There's his house, which you can still visit in Boston. It may be still in print. I don't know. It was, when did it come out? It sold so well that back when we used to have, oh, this is wonderful, right? This is the Copley painting of Revere. It used to be one of those things that you would see at book sales constantly. This one here is the Riverside Press out of at Houghton Mifflin Company, Boston, and Riverside Press, Cambridge, and it's 1942. But this thing's been reprinted so many times that you should be able to find a copy. And it's a good narrative history about a very important person. And what it does is it gives background into his world, just like it says, right? I mean, he's very valuable in my opinion, and it started me on my journey here. Let me get this back up here. What are some single-volume histories of the American Revolution that you've read? Well, I thought about grabbing the usual, like David McCullough's 1776, which sort of focused. Page Smith did a couple volumes at the start of his narrative. There's been so many. I tend not to gravitate towards those anymore. But one that I thought was particularly well done is This is the War of American Independence by Donald Higginbotham, who's a well-known character. This happens to be an Eastern Press. And it's Military Attitudes, Policies, and Practice, 1763 to 1789. And while it gives a very interesting military narrative of the war, it shows that stress between civilian control and a massive military endeavor. I mean, you're going up against the greatest empire in the world at the time. And how do you control that? What are the military policies? How did the battles affect that? So I haven't read this in years, but pulling off the shelf makes me want to reread it. So one I would strong. I wonder when this came out originally. This is so it came out in '71. This is Easton Press edition, but you can find it in other editions, I'm sure. Of course, I was excited to find this one when I did. That's my breaking news. Here, let me see here. So what is a multi-volume series, The American Revolution, that you would recommend? Well, I just started, and I've talked about on this channel. I haven't finished. I drifted off to other stuff. I started a writer I very much admire who did the great World War II trilogy, and that's Rick Atkinson, The British Are Coming. Fairly new here. This came out it's a Henry Holton Company, New York. When is this? This is 2019. The problem with this kind of treatment, and it's well written, but because of my own perspective and having read this stuff for so long, very important, when you're doing an overarching narrative history, sometimes the details have to get lost, otherwise it won't work. And in this, they get lost in a lot of the areas that I'm really interested in. But it does provide context for those. So if you're fairly new to reading about the American Revolution, I actually think it's quite valuable, and it's a very, very good read. I will finish it. I'm in a section now where happens to be an area of great interest to me, and it's just it made me sit down and go, okay, well, I know that, and that becomes a problem, and it's not really fair to the author, because the author's mission is different than what I may be asking from the book. The author is trying to give an overarching narrative, and this will be 3 volumes, I believe, a trilogy. So and he's doing really well. There's been some really exciting spots. So, what is your favorite book on American generals and soldiers during the American Revolution? Well, I am from a section of the country that has surrounded by a lot of American Revolutionary War activity and French and Indian War activity. And so that also makes it easy for me to be attracted to these types of volumes. I did a review for Open Letters Review, or Open Letters Monthly, I always mix the two up, of Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys and the American Revolution, Those Turbulent Sons of Freedom by Christopher Wren. Some of the earliest activity in the American Revolution, as far as with open conflict, actually, you don't hear much about. I can think nautically, or in the naval side of things, and let's not forget, Great Britain was a great naval power by then. So up in Machias, Maine, there was a battle, really early. And then in Vermont, in Westminster, you had conflict with what would become Vermont. Vermont became a republic, and only later joined as the first state to join the original 13 colonies, and was a bit of a military power itself, and was able to roust fast-moving guerrilla-type warfare. And this book gives that its due. It's not uncritical of all of that. It places things in context, deals with myth when it's myth. Myth always rises up around that sort of stuff, and this whole subject area, by the way. But a really well done story about those mountain soldiers that would descend out of the hills to protect and what their interest. United States didn't exist then, and their reason to be in the Revolution didn't always match maybe Massachusetts, and New York didn't match Massachusetts, and Georgia didn't match the Carolina. It was a very chaotic time that sometimes gets smoothed over, but for that type of warfare, this is a really interesting book and one I enjoy very much. I'll make sure I'm keeping on track here. Another one, so that was Ethan Allen, Seth Warner, John Stark from New Hampshire, because New Hampshire people had a lot to do with all that movement. Then the other one is Benedict Arnold, who was certainly a general and one of the most capable of the American Revolution, even though now mostly people think of him as just being a traitor. And this here is Arnold's march through Quebec, and this is through a howling wilderness. Thomas A. Desjardins, and this is 1775. This is a magnificent book, and there's many on this subject, about an absolutely grueling, punishing march across the howling wilderness, for sure, of northern Maine into Quebec to attack the British stronghold there. And this is very, very good narrative history. And another one, to get to some of these characters, is a biography by Willard Strone Randall, Patriot and Traitor. And the complexity of Arnold, who was a brilliant, maybe America's best field general, poorly treated by Congress, a jealous man, a powerful figure, and one who would clash. He was a very combative figure, which is why he was good at combat, right? But it's a nuanced story that's very, very interesting, and how things could have turned out differently. And so one I highly recommend. And then a counterpoint to him, and just as odd a fella, and a bigger than life, who either gets disdained by historians or the ones that admire him don't overstate their case because of their the reception it would get in academia. Is and by the same author, Willard Strone Randall, who does a wonderful job, is Ethan Allen, who was never going to be popular with the planters and aristocracy of Virginia, nor with the type of general that, for political reasons, that the rest of the country had to put up with George Washington. And so aristocratic planters and this fella were never going to get along. And he was talented, intellectually a pretty interesting fellow, but self-taught. He was a frontiersman of the First Order, and interesting family, and an interesting fate. So the one I'd strongly recommend, where you can get a wider view than you usually would get in a history. So let's see, we'll move on from the Americans here to British generals and soldiers. Let me read this properly. What are your favorite books on British generals and soldiers during the American Revolution? Now, I only really picked one here. And this is by Mark Urban, who's a wonderful military writer, history writer. This is Fusiliers, the saga of a British Redcoat regiment in the American Revolution. Great fun, very interesting. Let me see here. I might as well read a little bit of this. From Lexington Green in 1775 to Yorktown in 1781, one British regiment marched thousands of miles and fought a dozen battles to uphold British rule in America, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. Their story, and that of all the soldiers England sent across the Atlantic, is one of the few untold sagas of the American Revolution. Well, that's overstating it a bit, but and seeks to shed new light on the war itself, while offering surprising, at times unsettling insights into the way the war was conducted on both sides. Yeah, it's a really interesting book, and one that's well worth reading to get a little balance. So let's see here. What are a couple of your favorite books on individual battles and or campaigns during the American Revolution? Well, this one I absolutely love, and David Hackett Fisher, it's a historian I admire very much. He did a biography of Champlain that is brilliant. He's done lots of stuff. So, but this is Paul Revere's Ride. And the detail, and when did this come out? This came out in 94. This is an Eastern Press edition. The detail about that ride, the effect in the countryside, how complicated it was, and how well orchestrated. And just a fascinating story. There's just one of those focused histories that I really, really enjoy by a person who can really write and keep you entertained. Another one I would have to say here, make sure I'm doing this right, and then along the same line is Decisive Day, The Battle for Bunker Hill. This one is by Richard M. Ketchum. And let me see, an expanded and fully illustrated edition of The Battle for Bunker Hill. Eastern Press, but it originally came out in 62. And this is just full of harrowing detail. Mistakes and personalities and disasters and indecisiveness and brutality. It's a very, very interesting story. And then the best of them all, excuse me, and it's not one of those ones that's going to be easy to find. And this is Kenneth Roberts. It's The March to Quebec. And it's the diaries and the research he did for his book, Arundel, which is a story of Benedict Arnold in that march through the Maine wilderness to get to Quebec. And it's made up of the journals of the members of that expedition. This came out in 1938, and this is a first edition, so it may be difficult to find. So here's a casualty list of the Americans who attacked Quebec. It starts there. This is the research he did for his fiction, and it's one of my treasures. It's an incredible, incredible book. So that would be that question. So let's move on here. What's some of the books on the post-revolution that you have read? Well, I've read many. I didn't want to, because I did so many books on other things, I didn't want to give you a ton of them. But one of them here is the Whiskey Rebellion. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and the frontier rebels who challenged America's newfound sovereignty. And it's William Hoagland. And it is Scribner's, and it's from 2006. A gripping and provocative tale of violence, alcohol, and taxes. The Whiskey Rebellion pits President George Washington and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton against angry, armed settlers across the Appalachians. So, don't forget what we fought the Revolution for, right? Not parts of the country, it wasn't to put a new aristocracy in place. And these were people who were not too pleased with what was happening. So, pretty good that way. So, number 8, what is a favorite fiction book covering the American Revolution? For me, there's 2 or 3. I just grabbed a couple here. And they're Kenneth Roberts, to me, is he's an overlooked American treasure. I don't know why he's not in the Library of America. I've heard people say he's their favorite. People like David McCullough, people like that, who still read him. He was a huge bestseller in the United States. I have lots of his books. I grabbed a couple here that are sort of focused. And this one's Arundel. There's the map of Arnold's march through the wilderness. And that's what that previous volume is, the diaries of. This is Doubleday and Company, Garden City, New York, and this one is 1930, 1933, so second edition. Absolute masterwork. And another one in that is Rabble in Arms, also by Kenneth Roberts. And this is A Rabble in Arms, flush with success and insolence. General Burgoyne describes American troops, that's how he described them, as a rabble in arms. Here is a dramatic story of the campaigns of the Northern Army, from Sullivan's and Arnold's disastrous retreat from Quebec to the building of the first American Navy on Lake Champlain, and the overwhelming defeat of General Burgoyne and the British at Saratoga. And it is an epic story. So for fiction, Kenneth Roberts would be my favorite. And there's more. Let's see here. What is any other book you would like to mention dealing with the American Revolution? And he gives examples: Women's Histories, Prisons, Navy, Sons of Liberty, etc. So this one here is another one I did review for Open Letters, and that's Robert P. Watson's The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn, An Untold Story of the American Revolution. This, the prison ships were horrific, and this is quite a volume to work your way through. They were in New York Harbor, and they just were death traps. You were sent to them, and they were hulks. And how many Americans, I mean, they're war crimes, basically. I mean, the American prisoners are victims of war crimes, no matter how you look at it. And this is harrowing. The interesting thing is my library is on property donated from a woman who's a granddaughter of a soldier who survived these prison ships. So, and I found that out while I was reading this. So, great stuff. When did that come out? That just a couple years ago. DeCapo Press, 2017. Wonderful book. Another one I enjoyed is Patriot Pirates, The Privateer War for Freedom and Fortune in the American Revolution by Robert H. Patton. Very interesting book. They're legalized pirates, legalized by the Continental Congress, right? And that was part of the tradition back then. And this is Pantheon Books in New York, and this is 2008. An older volume, because I have a maritime history because of my own background, but so a little bit of a focus on that here. Ships and Seamen of the American Revolution, Vessels, Crews, Weapons, Gears, Naval Tactics, and Actions of the War of Independence. Written and illustrated by Jack Coggins. Big old thing. Seen better days, but I still love it. It Stackpole Books, and this is 1969. Give you an idea. There's all sorts of illustrations explaining things, tactics, weapons, all sorts of stuff. So just a great old book. Similar, maybe not quite as extensive, and doesn't have a dust jacket in this case. Navies of the American Revolution. This is Anthony Preston, David Leone, and John Batchelor, Prentice Hall Incorporated, England Cliffs. Came out in '75, Bison Books. Let me see, give you an idea. Good to, when you're reading, to have that kind of detail. You know what your terminology is referring to. A great fun read. And then to finish that off, again, Benedict Arnold. This, I don't have a dust jacket on this either. It seems to be a bit of a theme here. James L. Nelson, who also wrote wonderful nautical fiction set in the American Revolution. Biddlecombe was the character's name. So this is his nonfiction. He's been doing a lot of that. This is McGraw-Hill. It's Benedict Arnold's Navy, the ragtag fleet that lost the Battle of Lake Champlain but won the American Revolution. And there's a lot of truth in that, and this book will tell you why. And this came out in 2006. And, of course, here's Vermont, there's New York, and there's Lake Champlain that separates the two. And then Valcour Island is up here, right there. And that's where, with great ingenuity, Benedict Arnold, and great bravery, confronted the British. And it's quite the story, and it's well done here. So let me see where we're at. This is getting a bit long. Okay, recommended authors of the Revolutionary period. So for fiction, and in one case nonfiction, we have Kenneth Roberts. James Nelson on some of these aspects of maritime history. Rick Atkinson for general background. Some of the biographies, we're going Willard Stern Randall. There's just so many. I can't praise enough Page Smith and his multi-volume history, where he starts with some stuff on the Revolution. But it's a rabbit hole you can go down for the rest of your life. Maybe not quite as many books published as the American Civil War. I mean, I don't know that for a fact. I'm just assuming. But so much good stuff. And if you have you get a taste for certain parts of the country where the war happened, or theaters like the ocean or on land, or regions, or whatever, types of battles. Just great stuff. So I really, really enjoyed this tag. I hope you enjoyed some of the books. And thank you to Bill Ruttenberg. I'll put a link to his channel below. I have not had a chance to see tons of his stuff, but what I've watched, I've really enjoyed. And I'm late to get into his channel, but I'll definitely be keeping an eye on his stuff from here on out. So with that, I hope all is well, and thank you, BookTube.